A journey into the past. Imagine you're lying comfortably in your bed right now. A soft pillow supports your head. The air in the room is cool, and the sound of a fan or a sea hums softly in your ears. Outside the window, there might be a glow, the sound of passing cars, or the gentle pitter-patter of rain. Now, imagine if all of that were to vanish. The lights go out, the machines fall silent, there's no electricity, no familiar modern sounds. You open your eyes, and suddenly find yourself in a strange place. This isn't the 21st century. This isn't the era of the internet or modern technology. You've just been thrown into the distant past, far, far back, to an era people often call the Dark Ages, an age when Europe was ruled by feudal lords, an age when scientific knowledge hadn't widely developed, an age when plagues, wars, and superstition colored daily life. Today, we're going to try to live a full day in that time, just 24 hours. But those 24 hours could feel like a lifetime. And the question is simple: can you survive the darkness of a medieval night? Imagine you're lying comfortably in your bed right now. A warm blanket wraps around you, the room light is soft, and the quiet tick of a clock echoes in the corner. Everything feels safe, orderly, and certain now. Let's slowly pull our imagination back in time, past the modern years, beyond the Industrial Revolution, past the invention of electricity, to a time when the world was silent, harsh, and dark, the Middle Ages. When the sun set in that age, darkness truly meant darkness. There were no streetlights, no light from tall buildings, no glare from car headlights. Small villages were only lit by oil lamps, weak candles, or the glow from the hearth fires in homes. Outside, dense forests consumed the paths, and the darkness devoured everything beyond the reach of the firelight. For a modern person, night might be a time of quiet rest, but in the Middle Ages, night was a time of danger. As soon as the sun went down, life changed drastically. People would immediately bolt their wooden doors, close their flimsy windows that were just thin planks, and pray for a safe night. On a village path, the sound of footsteps could make your heart pound. Is that a neighbor coming home late? Or a bandit looking for an easy target? Robberies at night were very common. A poor person walking alone on a dark road could easily disappear, never to return, with no one ever knowing what happened. If you, a modern human, were suddenly thrown into that age just to walk at night, you would immediately feel how terrifying a world without light is. Imagine trying to walk on a slick, muddy path. To your left and right, only large trees creaking in the wind. Then you hear the distant howl of a wolf. In that era, wolves weren't just fairy tale creatures, they were real. Hungry wolves would often lurk on the outskirts of villages, waiting for a chance to prey on livestock or lone humans. You might want to turn on your phone for light, but, of course, that magical device hasn't been invented yet. The only options are a torch or a small candle that a gust of wind could easily extinguish. However, the darkness isn't just about wild animals or bandits. The night in the Middle Ages was also filled with fears created by the human mind itself. At that time, people believed that evil spirits, witches, and supernatural beings roamed after sunset. For them, every moving shadow, every sound of a snapping twig, could be a sign of something unseen. Now, imagine you have to sleep in a small, thin-walled wooden house with no electric light. Outside, the wind rustles dry leaves. The sounds of nature mix with whispers of fear in your head. Is that just the wind, or something else? People at that time often slept in groups for a sense of security. A family would huddle together in one room, lying on straw mats covered with rough wool blankets. If you're used to sleeping on a soft mattress with a fluffy pillow, you'd probably be restless all night. Your body would itch from the tiny insects living in the straw. The smell of wood smoke, sweat, and human bodies would fill the air. But that's the reality. The night in the Middle Ages was a test of patience, endurance, and courage. Try to imagine it more deeply. You're lying on that straw mat. The small oil lamp in the corner has already gone out because oil is expensive and can't be used continuously. Darkness now envelops everything. The only sounds are the faint snores of others, the occasional cries of a baby, and the howl of a wolf that sounds like it's getting closer. Slowly, sleepiness starts to come, but there's no feeling of security. You know that the house door is just a thin piece of wood that anyone could break down. There are no modern metal locks, no police on patrol. Only prayer can be a protector. Imagine also the night air. Without modern heating, the air is bone-chilling. In winter, the cold could make your teeth chatter even when you're wrapped in a wool blanket. The small fire in the hearth would quickly die down, and you'd have to get up to add more wood. If not, the room would soon freeze over. Truly, surviving just one night is an accomplishment. In that age, people learned to sleep with a sense of alert caution. Unlike us who can sleep soundly until morning, they often woke up several times. Some would get up to make sure the livestock weren't stolen. Others would check the fire in the hearth. And still others would just be awake from nightmares about the supernatural things believed to be roaming outside. You might wonder, how could people truly rest in such conditions? The answer, they were used to it. Fear, cold, and danger were part of daily life. Their bodies adapted, their minds accepted that the night was never truly safe. For us, accustomed to bright streetlights and the sound of car engines that signal life is still going on out there, the total darkness of the Middle Ages would feel suffocating. A silence that is too deep can make your ears ring. Every small sound would feel like a threat, so, if you truly lived there, you most likely wouldn't be able to sleep soundly. Fear and discomfort would make the night feel incredibly long. And when dawn finally arrives, it's not the end of the suffering, but the beginning of a new day, full of other challenges. Tentu, ini terjemahan teksnya ke dalam bahasa Inggris. A harsh morning smell, filth, and hunger. Imagine the long night is finally over. Dawn slowly breaks over the horizon. The sun hasn't fully appeared yet, only a faint golden-orange light creeping from behind the hills and trees. The sound of a rooster begins to crow, marking the arrival of morning in a small medieval village. For us, morning is synonymous with comfort. A cup of warm coffee, soft bread, maybe a nutritious breakfast with fresh fruit. But in the Middle Ages, morning was not a pleasant start. It was a call to return to the struggle of a harsh life. Imagine, you've just woken up after sleeping on a straw bed that is itchy and damp. Your body is still aching, the rough wool blanket clinging to you because the morning air is bone-chilling. Before you can even breathe in a fresh breath, your nose is immediately assaulted by an intensely strong smell. The smell of sweat from bodies huddled together all night. The smell of wood smoke from the hearth that is now just ash. The smell of animal dung stuck to shoes, carried into the house. And the strongest smell of all, human waste. Yes, in the Middle Ages, toilets as we know them today did not exist. Most people used clay pots or wooden buckets to relieve themselves. In the morning, the contents of those buckets had to be thrown out of the house, often into the street or a small ditch beside the village. So, the morning air was not fresh, but a mix of aromas that are difficult for us in the modern era to imagine. After waking up, the first task isn't to brew coffee, but to rekindle the fire in the hearth. Without fire, the house would remain cold. Water couldn't be boiled. Food couldn't be cooked. Fire was the lifeblood of the household, and every morning, someone had to struggle to bring the small embers left from the night back to life, with gentle puffs of air and a few pieces of wood. If the fire went out completely, they had to ask a neighbor for embers. And that was no small feat. It meant walking in the cold morning air with a small container, being careful that the fire didn't die on the way. Now, let's look at their breakfast. There's no hot rice, sweet bread, or fragrant tea. For a poor peasant, the morning meal was usually just a piece of hard bread baked days before. The bread was often so hard that it had to be dipped in water or a thin soup to be bitten. If they were lucky, there was a little porridge from grain or barley, boiled with water. It tasted bland, with almost no seasoning. Sugar was too expensive, and honey wasn't always available. Sometimes, only a little salt gave it flavor. For most people, meat was a luxury. They might only eat it a few times a year, usually on major religious holidays. So, don't imagine a morning with the aroma of sausages, bacon, or fried eggs. Those were only for nobles or wealthy monasteries. Drinking water. In many places, river or well water wasn't always clean. Unboiled water could carry deadly diseases. Therefore, many people, including children, more often drank thin, low-alcohol beer, called small beer. It tasted weak, but it was safer than water. If you, a modern person, suddenly had to drink beer instead of water every morning, your body would probably be shocked. But for them, it was a part of everyday life. Let's step outside for a moment. The village roads weren't paved, just dirt that was muddy when it rained and dusty in the dry season. In the morning, people would start pouring buckets of household waste into the street. You'd have to be careful where you stepped to avoid something disgusting. The smell of filth mixed with the smell of animals kept around the house. Horses, cows, goats, and chickens roamed freely, leaving traces everywhere. Small children, barefoot, would run on that road as if it were completely normal. In larger towns, conditions could be even worse. Narrow streets were filled with waste dumped directly from windows. People would often yell "heads up below" before emptying their buckets. If you were passing by, your head could be the target. Then, imagine you have to start your workday after all that. No morning shower with warm water, no fragrant soap. Even just washing your face with clean water could be a luxury. Medieval people rarely bathed. They believed that bathing too often could weaken the body. So, the human body at that time was accustomed to smells that we, as modern people, would find difficult to tolerate. The simple breakfast is gone. Now it's time to work. For a peasant, work awaited in the fields since dawn. They had to hoe the soil, plant, or harvest, depending on the season. Everything was done with their own strength, or with the help of animals, without machines. Their stomachs were never truly full. The hard bread and thin porridge weren't enough to provide energy, but they had no choice. Hard work was a necessity. If they didn't, the family could starve. Try to imagine yourself walking out of the house, breathing in the cold morning air, and then realizing the immense weight of the work that awaits. Mud clings to your feet. The air is a mix of wood smoke, filth, and human bodies. You might lose your appetite just from the smell, but for them, that was reality. There was no other option, so if you truly lived in the Middle Ages, the morning would not be a fresh start. Morning was a reminder that a full day of suffering had just begun, and a simple breakfast might be the only energy you could rely on until night fell again. Danger at every corner, disease and small wounds that kill. Imagine the morning has just begun. The cold air is slowly replaced by sunlight penetrating the thin wooden window. However, in the Middle Ages, sunlight didn't mean safety. Instead, it revealed a harsh reality. Danger was at every corner, waiting without mercy. Life at that time didn't know the word safe. A person could die from something that to us, as modern people, seems trivial. A small cut, a scratch, or even a toothache could become a slow death sentence. Let's imagine a morning. A farmer is walking in his field. His hand holds a blunt sickle. His feet are bare, or only covered with thin cloth or wooden sandals. While working, his foot gets scratched by a sharp stone. A small wound opens, blood comes out. He just wipes it with a dirty cloth and returns to work. For us, that's not a big deal. Just clean it with water, apply antiseptic, and cover it with a bandage. It'll be healed tomorrow. But in the Middle Ages, there was no antiseptic, no bandages, no antibiotics. That small wound could get infected. In a few days, pus would appear, the skin would swell, and a high fever would strike. In a week, that person could die just because of a small cut on their foot. Disease and infection were the greatest enemies of humans at that time. Doctors existed, but their knowledge was still influenced by superstition and old, incorrect theories. They believed that illness came from an imbalance of the body's humus blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. If someone was sick, the common solution was to let out their blood with a knife or leeches, believing that the body would become balanced again. However, instead of healing, many people became weaker and died faster from losing too much blood. Imagine if you had a high fever at that time. There was no paracetamol, no antibiotics. All you had were herbal concoctions that might not work, prayers from a priest, or even rituals to cast out evil spirits believed to be the cause of the illness. If you had a toothache, in the modern era, a dentist can extract it with a sterile tool. But in the Middle Ages, teeth were pulled with rough iron pliers, without anesthesia. The pain was excruciating, and the risk of a post-extraction infection could be fatal. Let's talk about children. Infants and toddlers in the Middle Ages rarely survived to adulthood. Child mortality rates were very high. Simple illnesses like diarrhea or a cough could take a life because there was no adequate treatment. Parents were used to losing children. The sadness was, of course, deep, but it became a part of life. Many families had a lot of children not just to help with work in the fields, but also as a guarantee that some of them would survive. Now, let's imagine you, a modern person, are stuck there. You fall a little while walking on a rocky path, scraping your knee. You might not pay attention to the small wound. However, in a world without antibiotics, that wound could be the beginning of a slow journey towards death. Or maybe you drink water from a village well. The water looks clear, but it's mixed with dangerous bacteria. After a few hours, your stomach starts to hurt. You vomit and have severe diarrhea. Without IV reation medicine, your body will weaken. In a matter of days, you could die. Not only that, there were other dangers that were always lurking. Rats. Rats were everywhere, especially in large cities full of garbage and waste. These small animals weren't just a nuisance. They were carriers of a deadly disease, later known as the Black Plague. But even before that plague arrived, rats were already carrying fleas and germs that often made people sick. They lived side by side with humans, crawling under straw beds, stealing food from kitchens, and leaving diseases in every corner of the house. Then, there was also danger from the food itself. Without refrigerators or modern preservation, food spoiled quickly. Bread could get moldy, meat could rot, and grain could be contaminated with poisonous fungi. The poor had no choice but to eat it anyway. As a result, food poisoning was common, adding to the long list of daily sufferings. Now imagine you're sitting at a small wooden table. In front of you, a bowl of thin grain porridge. You're hungry, so you eat quickly. However, the grain turns out to contain ergot fungus, a natural poison that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. People at that time often didn't know the cause. They thought it was a curse or punishment from God. Imagine how terrifying it must have been to live in a world where every bite of food could be poison, every sip of water could be a disease, and every small scratch could mean the end. There was no health insurance, no modern hospitals. In fact, hospitals at that time were more like shelters for the sick and poor, not places for healing. If you were rich, you could call a private physician. But if you were poor, your only hope was prayer. And what's even more terrifying, all of this was considered normal. People were used to seeing death. In the market, in the fields, on the streets, death was always present. There was no guarantee that someone who left for work in the morning would come home safely in the afternoon. The locked castes of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, society was rigidly divided into distinct social classes or castes. There was no American dream where hard work and skill could lead to a better life. The world was a static hierarchy, and your place was decided the moment you were born. Royalty and high nobility, these were the kings, queens, and lords who owned all the land, made the laws, and held all the power. They lived lives of comfort and luxury, largely untouched by the hardships faced by the common people, knights and warriors. Their role was to protect the nobles and their lands. They trained for war from a young age and lived a life centered on combat and honor. Clergy and church officials. The church held immense spiritual and political authority, often wielding more influence than the king. The clergy were the keepers of knowledge and had a powerful say in people's daily lives. Peasants, laborers, and serfs. This was the largest group, and their lives were defined by grueling labor and poverty. They worked the land for the nobles, and had to give most of their crops away as rent or tax. Moving between these classes was nearly impossible. Your life was a predetermined path, the life of a peasant, a cycle of hardship. Imagine being born as a peasant in a small straw hut. Your life's path is already set. You'll learn to hoe the fields, tend to livestock, and eventually marry another peasant. Big dreams were non-existent, and the possibility of becoming a noble, let alone a king, was completely out of reach. Peasants didn't own the land they worked on. They were tenant farmers who had to give a huge portion of their harvest to the noble lord. For every 10 sacks of grain they harvested, they might only be able to keep 3 or 4. The rest belonged to the lord and the church. If the harvest failed due to bad weather, they would still have to pay their taxes, often leading to starvation. The contrast with the nobility was extreme. While peasants toiled in the fields, nobles feasted on roasted meats, soft bread, and fine wine in their castles. Their hands were soft, their clothes were fine, and their existence depended entirely on the labor of the thousands of peasants outside their walls. Rebellion or resignation, if you were a modern person thrown into this reality, knowing that your intelligence or hard work wouldn't change your fate, you would likely feel immense frustration. You might consider fleeing to a city, but even there, you'd face a life of poverty and danger, likely ending up as a beggar or, worse, being punished for theft just to survive. The opportunities for social advancement were extremely rare, reserved only for the most exceptional individuals, and even then, it was a near impossible feat. Most people never left the village where they were born. They lived, worked, married, and died on the same land, under the same sky, and to the sound of the same church bell. Their world was incredibly small, while their suffering was immense. The church reinforced this system by teaching that poverty and suffering were part of God's plan. They were taught that obedience and patience would be rewarded in heaven. This belief kept people subservient and prevented widespread rebellion. Choosing to rebel was a gamble with a cruel punishment. Any small uprising would be quickly and brutally suppressed by the Lord's armed men. The penalties for rebellion were severe: hanging, beheading, or being burned alive. For most, choosing the path of resignation was the only logical choice. Born poor, lived poor, died poor. That was the unyielding cycle of destiny in the Middle Ages. The power of the sword and the cross. Living under the shadow of the king and the church. Imagine the sun beginning to set in the west. The fields are slowly dimmed by the orange light of dusk. The farmers, who have been working hard since morning, return home one by one, their bodies weary. Yet, even though the day is almost over, a sense of security is never truly present, because in the Middle Ages, there were two great powers that always governed human life: the sword and the cross. Both the king and the church stood above everyone, controlling the fate of millions of souls. The sword, the power of kings and nobles. Every inch of land in the Middle Ages belonged to someone more powerful. The peasants might have been the ones working it, but the land still belonged to the nobility. And above all nobles, there was the king, who was considered God's representative on earth. Imagine a magnificent castle, standing tall on a hill. Stone walls, dozens of feet high, protected it from enemies. A flag flew on the highest tower. From a distance, a small peasant could see it, and realize how great the distance was between themselves and the ruler who lived inside. The king's power was indisputable. A single command from him could determine life or death. The local nobility bowed to him, and the common people did not even dare to utter his name without a sense of respect and fear. However, the king's power was not just words. It was enforced with the sword. Fully armed knights guarded the castle, ready to crush rebellion, war, or threats from neighboring kingdoms. Imagine you are a peasant who is late in paying taxes. You cannot hide. The Lord's soldiers could come at any time, knock on the door of your wooden house, or even break it down. They carried swords, spears, and a cold, merciless expression. If you resisted, blood would be spilled. This kind of fear kept the people always submissive. They knew the sword could speak faster than words. The cross, the unseen power of the church, however, the power of the sword alone was not enough. Above it all, there was a power that was more subtle, deeper, and more terrifying. The cross. The church was the center of both spiritual and political life. For people of the Middle Ages, heaven and hell were not just stories. but a reality that awaited after death. The church held the key to salvation, and that made it more powerful than any sword. Imagine a magnificent cathedral in the middle of a town. The bells chimed every morning and evening. Their sound echoed, reminding everyone that their lives were not entirely their own. Everyone was required to go to church, kneel, pray, and pay tithes, a special tax for the church. Failing to do so was not just a violation of the law, but a violation of God's will. The priest spoke from the pulpit, his voice deep and authoritative. He reminded the congregation that suffering in this world was just a test, and that patience would be rewarded in heaven. In contrast, anyone who was disobedient would feel the fires of hell forever. Imagine you are listening to him. Your body is tired, your stomach is hungry, but your heart is filled with fear. What if you have sinned unknowingly? What if your soul is cursed? No one dared to question the priest's words, because he was considered a messenger of God. The meeting of the sword and the cross. Sometimes the sword and the cross worked together. The king needed legitimacy from the church, and the church needed the king's power to enforce its teachings. A king could be crowned with the blessing of the archbishop, and without it, his power was considered weak. In turn, the church used the king's soldiers to punish anyone considered a heretic. Imagine a peasant who dared to defy the church's teachings. Perhaps he said that the plague was not a punishment from God, but something that could be explained by reason. To us, that sounds normal, but to them, it was heresy. What would happen? The peasant could be arrested by the soldiers, brought to a church court, and punished in public. The punishment could be imprisonment, flogging, or even being burned alive. Everything was done in the name of preserving faith. You can imagine how the common people lived in a cycle of fear. Fear of the king's sword, and fear of the hell the church taught about. A reflection for a modern person now. Let's imagine you are living there. You are used to living in a modern world full of freedom of expression. You can talk about science, criticize leaders, or even reject certain religious teachings without being sentenced to death. However, in the Middle Ages, one wrong word could be the end of your life. If you said the sun might not revolve around the earth, you could be accused of heresy. If you refused to pay taxes, you could be imprisoned. If you fought back, the sword and the cross would fall upon your head together. Living under these two great shadows made people accustomed to submission. They walked with their heads bowed, spoke carefully, and always tried to appear devout. The night arrives, the day begins to get dark again. After a day of hard work in the fields and submission to the rules, the people return to their homes, but the fear remains. They know that at any time, a messenger from the noble could knock on their door, or a priest could accuse them of wrongdoing, and as they lie on their rough straw mats, staring at the fragile wooden ceiling, they pray silently. May God protect them from the sword in this world and from hell in the afterlife. Tent ini terjemahan teksnya ke dalam bahasa Inggris. The shadow of the Black Death. When death came without limit, imagine walking through a small town in the Middle Ages. The narrow streets are filled with mud, and the smell of human and animal waste is a thick mixture in the air. The dampness stings your nose. But today, something feels different. People are whispering. Their faces are pale. In the distance, a bell tolls not the usual church bell that calls the faithful, but a death knell. A monk walks slowly, swinging a small bell, a sign that someone has just died. However, death here isn't coming one by one. It's coming like a storm, sweeping away anyone in its path without discrimination. This is when the world was struck by the Black Death, when the plague swept the city in the 14th century. Europe was shaken by one of the greatest tragedies in human history, the Black Death. The disease spread with an unimaginable speed. In a short time, villages, towns, and even kingdoms crumbled. Imagine you see a neighbor who is healthy this morning. By the afternoon, he starts coughing and complains of a headache. By evening, his body is covered in black swellings in his armpits and groin. These are the buboes, a classic sign of the disease. By nightfall, he could be lying stiff, covered with a makeshift cloth. There was no cure, no explanation, nothing could stop the death. A fear that spreads faster than the disease, the city turned into a terrifying place. People locked their doors, not daring to go outside. Some left their sick families behind, running to the countryside, hoping to survive. But the disease paid no heed to boundaries. It spread through rats and fleas that hitched rides on every cart, every sack of grain, and even on the clothes of merchants. Imagine the fear felt by the common people. They didn't understand what bacteria were. They only knew that people were dying for no reason. The church, too, was confused. Some believed it was God's wrath, while others blamed foreigners or certain groups. Rumors and accusations flew. Many sought a scapegoat, leading to the expulsion and murder of minority groups who were believed to be carriers of the disease. Streets filled with corpses. Imagine walking on the city streets. Carts of corpses pass by every day, being pulled to a mass grave outside the city walls. The ground was too hard to dig individual graves, so bodies were piled in large pits. The smell of decay was suffocating. People covered their noses with wet cloths, hoping to protect themselves, but that thin cloth was no match for a disease that crept in without a sound. At night, the sound of weeping could be heard from every house. Not a single family was spared completely. Children, the elderly, even the nobles living in their castles, succumbed one by one. The plague doctor, if you were lucky, you might see a strange figure walking through the city. He wore a long black cloak, leather gloves, and a mask with a long beak like a bird. This was the so-called plague doctor. They believed that the long beak, which was filled with herbs and dried flowers, could filter out the poisonous air, but in reality, it was nothing more than a false hope. The doctor was just as vulnerable as anyone else, but their image added to the terrifying atmosphere. Imagine seeing one enter a neighbor's house. You knew it meant someone inside was dying, and perhaps tomorrow it would be your house's turn. A modern person in the midst of the plague now. Imagine if you, from the modern age, were trapped in the midst of the Black Death. You might know that the disease was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria spread by rat fleas. You know how to prevent it: hygiene, sanitation, and antibiotics. But there, in the Middle Ages, you would have access to none of it. You could only watch as death took one person after another. You would want to tell them about washing hands, about how to dispose of waste, about keeping a distance. But who would believe you? At that time, medical science was still shrouded in superstition. If you spoke too loudly, you could be considered a heretic and punished by the church. The plague that changed the world, the Black Death, killed nearly a third to a half of Europe's population. Cities became silent. Fields were left empty because there was no one to plant crops. Markets collapsed because there were no merchants. However, from that darkness, change slowly began to emerge. With a scarcity of labor, peasants began to demand more rights. The nobility lost their power little by little. The church was also shaken. as prayers proved powerless to stop death. But all of that would only happen far in the future. If you were truly living there, in the midst of the plague, you would feel only one thing: despair. A night full of prayer. Imagine night falling over a plague-stricken city. There's no laughter, no music, just a silence filled with fear. People are praying before a cross, hoping for God's mercy. You, too accustomed to the modern world, might find yourself kneeling, because in the face of death that comes without reason, science and logic feel useless. And as the last candle goes out, darkness envelops the room. You go to sleep with the same prayer as millions before you. May you still be breathing when morning arrives. Tent. Ini adalah terjemahan teks Anda ke dalam bahasa Inggris. If you lived there, adapting is impossibly imagined. One night, you fall asleep in a comfortable, modern bed with clean sheets, cool air from an air conditioner, and the quiet sounds of a modern city outside your window. But when you open your eyes, you are no longer in the same world. There's no electricity, no sound of vehicles, no cell phone next to your pillow. You wake up in a small wooden house with a leaky thatched roof and a rough straw mat that pricks your skin. Welcome to the Middle Ages, and here, you almost certainly wouldn't survive a single day. The shocking morning in the morning, you might look for water to wash your face. But all you find is a wooden bucket filled with murky water taken from the river last night. It doesn't smell fresh, it's slightly fishy, and it's mixed with mud. In the modern world, you wouldn't willingly dip your hands into it. But here, it's the only option. Imagine drinking it. An unfamiliar taste immediately assaults your tongue, and your stomach begins to revolt. This water is full of bacteria, parasites, and filth, something your modern body, accustomed to clean water, cannot tolerate. Within hours, you might already be sick. The unfamiliar food, you're hungry. You look for breakfast. There's no soft white bread, no warm coffee, let alone pasteurized milk. All that's available is a piece of hard, black bread that you have to chew with great effort. Imagine the taste: bitter, sour, slightly moldy. Sometimes the bread is mixed with old grain or ground nut husks. If you're lucky, you might get a thin porridge of barley, bland without salt, eaten with a raw onion. Your body, used to nutritious modern food, will be in shock. Your stomach is nauseous, your head is dizzy, and your energy is low. An unbearable smell. If you try to walk outside, you'll immediately be greeted by a pungent smell. There's no sewage system. Human and animal waste is often dumped directly into the streets. Domesticated animals roam free, leaving droppings everywhere. The morning air is not fresh, but a mix of wood smoke, the stench of stale meat, and dirty mud. Your modern body might want to cover its nose, but the people there are accustomed to it. The risk of disease, small scratch on your hand from the rough wood, could turn into a dangerous infection. There's no antiseptic, no sterile bandages, only a dirty cloth and prayer. A single insect bite could bring on a fever. One piece of undercooked meat could lead you to your deathbed. Your modern body, without natural immunity to the medieval environment, would be overwhelmed. Imagine, even people born in that era could die young, let alone you, who were suddenly thrown into it. The difficulty of language and customs. You try to talk to the locals, but their language is different, rough, and full of strange accents. No one understands your words. You are seen as a foreigner, perhaps a suspicious wanderer, in a world full of suspicion. A foreigner could easily be accused of being a plague carrier, a spy, or even a witch. One wrong look, one strange movement, and you could be banished, beaten, or even burned at the stake. No technology, no savior. You feel your pocket, hoping to find your cell phone. It's not there. You can't call for help. You can't reach anyone. You're alone in a harsh and foreign world. You're used to electric lights, but now there's only a small candle that quickly burns out. You're used to clean clothes, but now there's only a rough cloth that makes your skin itch. You're used to medicine, but now there are only concoctions that are often more dangerous than the illness itself. The terrifying night falls. You try to sleep, but strange sounds fill the air. The barking of stray dogs, the howling of wolves in the distance, and the creaking of the fragile wooden house. There are no secure locks on the door, no police to protect you. If robbers come, all you can do is surrender. If a fire consumes the straw house, you can't escape quickly. On the straw bed, your body is itchy because of the fleas and insects hiding in the mat. You writhe, trying to find a comfortable position, but you're increasingly aware that sleep in this world is not rest, but a test. Conclusion: impossible to survive one day in the Middle Ages is enough to break your modern body. The dirty water, the poor food, the toxic air, the invisible diseases, and the fear of the power of the sword and the cross. Maybe you could endure for a few hours with determination, but your body would slowly give up. A fever, diarrhea, an infected wound, or even an accusation of heresy from the people around you would become the end of your short journey. And before the second night arrives, you would realize you truly would not survive a single day in the Middle Ages. Lessons from the darkness. Gratitude for the modern world. Imagine it's late at night. The wind blows softly outside your window, and the world feels calm. After a long journey into the shadows of the Middle Ages, passing through nights without electricity, relentless hunger, piercing smells, the fear of the sword, and the threat of plague, we now return to a modern bed. Take a slow breath. Feel the clean air filling your lungs. Listen to the gentle sounds around you, not the screams of pain or the tolling of a death knell, but the quiet sounds of a modern night. Tonight, before you close your eyes, let's reflect. What lessons can we learn from all that darkness? Shadows, that became our teacher. The Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages, but that doesn't mean humanity stopped dreaming. On the contrary, from that suffering, resilience was born, knowledge was born, and the determination to seek a better world was born. Imagine a small child in a village who is hungry every day but still grows up to be a strong adult. Imagine a monk who copies books by hand for hours, ensuring that knowledge isn't lost to time. Imagine a peasant who, despite his fear of the sword and the cross, still dares to plant seeds in the ground for the hope of a future harvest. From that suffering, humanity learned to endure. From that fear, a desire to understand was born. And from that darkness, the light that eventually led the world to the age of enlightenment was born. Gratitude for the modern world. Now, let's compare that to our world. You can turn on a light with a small switch. You can drink clean water straight from the tap. You can get treatment when you're sick, without fearing death from a small wound. You live in a world with music, books, the internet, and freedom of speech. There is no longer a sword threatening you from a noble, nor is a cross used to silence your voice. What was once impossible for people in the Middle Ages is now commonplace for us. Imagine if you could go back there and tell them about this world. They would probably think you were an angel or a witch, because modern life would seem like a miracle. A night of reflection tonight. As your body rests, let your mind be thankful. Be thankful that you were born in this era. Be thankful that you can enjoy freedom, health, and comfort. If a single day in the Middle Ages felt impossible to get through, then a single day in the modern world is a great gift. Concluding the journey now, let's slowly return from our long journey. Imagine the distant castle fading away, the muddy roads disappearing, the church bells ceasing to toll. Imagine the mist of time closing over all those dark scenes, bringing you back to your warm and safe room. You are lying in a comfortable bed. Fresh air fills the room. Outside, there is no plague, no soldiers, no absolute darkness. There is only a quiet night and dreams waiting. And before your eyes truly close, remember this. The Middle Ages gave us an important lesson that humans can endure through the darkest suffering. But you, living today, already have the light.